Hi, everyone. My name is Felicia Lopez, and I'm speaking to you today from unceded Yokut and Miwok land in today's Merced, California. Welcome and thank you for joining us today as we discuss Dr. Kevin Terraciano's latest book, Codex Sierra, a Nahuatl Mixteca book of accounts from colonial Mexico. To give some personal background, I first met Kevin about 6 years ago when I was a graduate student, and I drove in from Santa Barbara to audit his Nahuatl class. I admit that before we met, I was a bit intimidated. Kevin Terraciano has an impressive CV with over 50 publications, including articles, edited volumes, and books on Zapotec, Mixtec, and Nahua people and texts from colonial Mexico. And meeting him as a new Nahuatl student, I knew enough about these different languages, Nahuatl, Mixtec, and Zapotec, to know that I was learning the easiest one of the three, and he was publishing about all three. But what struck me most about Kevin on the day that we met was his humility, his kindness, and his generosity with me as a young aspiring scholar. He was bringing in native Nahuatl speakers to teach, insisting that we remember that they are the experts in their languages and in their cultures. He maintains strong relationships with Indigenous people, and he amplifies their voices throughout his work, such as in the upcoming Nahuatl conference that's being held this Friday. He also works to bring other people of color, women of color, and Latinx people like myself up through academia. The day we met, he took time out of his always busy schedule to talk to me and walk around UCLA with me. And on that day, he offered to mentor me, and he has been mentoring me. And since that time, Kevin has continually impressed me, not only as the renowned scholar that he is, but as an ally to Indigenous and other people of color, as well as in his role as a loving father and husband, and as my mentor and friend. It is an honor to present to you all Dr. Kevin Terraciano.
Thank you so much for those kind words, Felicia. I really appreciate it. Let me say a few words about Felicia Lopez. Received her PhD from Chicano Studies at University of California, Santa Barbara. Became a UC Presidential Postdoctoral Scholar in Native American Studies at UC Davis before moving to UCLA to work in history. She's now Assistant Professor of English and Chicanx Studies in the Literatures, Languages, and Cultures Department at UC Merced. She specializes in Mesoamerican writing systems and visual culture, has studied Huastec and Nahuatl, and is working especially with images of Mayawel, the underappreciated goddess of Mage, Pulque, and fertility in the Codex Borgia and other Nahuatl manuscripts, the subject of her dissertation. She's also a good friend of the LAI in that she's worked closely with Veronica Zavala, our outreach coordinator, in K through 12 workshops. Last year, we collaborated with the Getty Research Institute for such a workshop on Mesoamerica and the conquest of Mexico. And she is doing the same with the LAI this year in collaboration with LACMA. So it's a true pleasure to have this conversation with Felicia, whom I respect and admire greatly, about this new book of mine. But before we get into our conversation, let me acknowledge that as a land-grant institution, the Latin American Institute at UCLA acknowledges the Gabrielino Tongva peoples as the traditional land caretakers of Tovangar, the Los Angeles Basin's Southern Channel Islands. I would also like to thank our co-sponsors, the Center for Mexican Studies and its current director, Ruben Hernandez Leon, who will be the incoming director of the Latin American Institute beginning July 1st, the American Indian Studies Center at UCLA, and the Department of History for this inaugural book talk series. This is the first of a series featuring the recently published books of faculty who are associated with the LAI. In the fall, we'll have a talk by Professor Martin Van Delden about his new book on Octavio Paz's life and work, a book published recently by Vanderbilt University Press. So let's begin our conversation then, Felicia.
Okay, sounds good. This is exciting. And so I have a copy of your book here, and I just want to say, for those of you who are interested and or are watching this because you're interested in learning about the book and whether or not you want to buy it, I have to say it is one of the most beautiful books. I really enjoy it. It's the kind of book that makes me wish I had two copies, so I could read what you're writing about it on one copy and then look at the images that are later on in the text at the same time. I spend a lot of time flipping back and forth, looking at the images that you're referencing. So really a beautiful book. And I was hoping we could start off with you telling us a little bit about the origins and the evolution of this book project. I know you mentioned a little bit in your introduction about first looking at it, working with one of your mentors, James Lockhart, but I was hoping you could tell us a little bit more about that.
Yeah, absolutely. As a graduate student at UCLA in the beginning in 1987, 88, I began to study Nahuatl with Jim Lockhart. I mean, he was so gracious and generous. He worked with us in his office, and he invited us into his home to work on translating texts. And there was very little introduction. It was just sort of, immersion from the very beginning. And working with him, I realized that there had been so many breakthroughs studying Nahuatl language manuscripts from the colonial period. There are thousands of them, hundreds of thousands of them. And I wondered whether any other indigenous peoples had written in their own language. And so I fixed on Oaxaca, thinking that the Mixtecs and Zapotecs in particular had such strong pre-conquest writing traditions that, those traditions would have served as a precedent for writing in the colonial period with the alphabet. And so I went looking for native language documents, and I ended up finding hundreds of Mixtec language documents. So I became really interested in trying to learn Mixtec while learning Nahuatl. And so this fascination with the Codex Sierra goes back to my book on the Mixtecs of colonial Oaxaca, in which I talk about the Codex Sierra. I spend a few pages talking about the manuscript, but I really couldn't do it the justice that it deserves because I was also analyzing other Nahuatl documents from the early period written in the Mixteca region of Oaxaca, as well as hundreds of Mixtec language documents. So that when I first saw Nicolas Leon's 1933 edition, which was reprinted in 1982, when I was a graduate student at UCLA, I was fascinated with the text. I ended up presenting on the Codex Sierra at the Tercer Simposio Internacional de Códices y Documentos sobre México in Puebla in 1996. And there I met Hilda Aguirre Beltran, the daughter of the famous anthropologist Gonzalo Aguirre Beltran, and who had worked on the Codex Sierra. And I had great conversations with her about the text. And I also met Luis Reyes Garcia, the great Nahuatl scholar, who encouraged me to continue my work on the manuscript. And there in Puebla, I saw the original manuscript for the first time, because that's where it is. Since then, I've examined the text several times. It was moved to the Biblioteca Histórica de José María La Fragua at BUAP, the autonomous University of Puebla. And when I told Jim Lockhart that I wanted to translate the text, he was really encouraging. He said he would be happy to review my transcription and translation. Because the problem with Leon's 1933 publication was that it wasn't a facsimile, it was a line drawing of the text. And the translation of the Nahuatl was generally good, but imperfect. Whoever copied the alphabetic script introduced occasional errors into the copy by not recognizing and thus not reproducing faithfully the original orthography. and and as I said, the translation had some problems, and there are no notes to the Nahuatl, which is such an interesting Nahuatl because it's Nahuatl written outside of central Mexico in a community that spoke other languages. So that Jim was happily helping me with the translation, comparing the Nahuatl with Central Mexican variants, and other variants in so-called peripheral areas, observing some archaic forms that were no longer used in central Mexico in the 16th century. And so we were just having a great time with the text. And unfortunately, he fell ill and was forced to stop after we got about 20 pages into the 62-page manuscript. He never told me what was happening, but I knew that he was ill. And I knew that he must have been very ill if he wasn't going to do Nahuatl, because he loved doing Nahuatl. And then, suddenly he was gone, and I mourned his loss for some time, but found the strength to continue the work, and benefited so much from his analysis and commentary on the first third of the manuscript. Well, thanks for asking me that.
Yeah, and I'll say that, I feel like you've been very fortunate. I mean, James Lockhart, for people who are familiar with the field, I mean, he's just one of the founding fathers of this kind of study. And so it's really, really fortunate that you were able to work with him so closely on that. And it's also very fortunate that you've been able to examine this text in person. I know so many of these early manuscripts are under lock and key, most of them in Europe, and so that this one is actually still in Mexico, and that you've been able to access it and look at it is really, really kind of a wonderful thing. I wanted to pick up on something that you're talking about there, about how this is a text that is being written in Nahuatl and it's outside of central Mexico. And, I want to bring up just it says in your book title how this is a rare text, right? But just how remarkable it is that this is a text that is using so many different languages, right? Yes, it's written in alphabetic Nahuatl, but it's also got Mixtec words, and it's got it's written in the Latin alphabet. It's got Greek and Arabic numbers, and it's got this pre-contact Mesoamerican writing system that arguably is intelligible by a wide variety of linguistic groups. Can you tell us a little bit about what you're seeing there in all of this mixture, and why this is taking place? What's happening here that people are writing with all of these different systems in one single document?
Yeah, it's a good question. It's a truly unique manuscript. I mean, it's now inscribed on UNESCO's Memory of the World Register. First of all, it's so early for alphabetic writing in Nahuatl, and it was done in a place where people were not speaking Nahuatl all the time. The community that produced this text, Texupan, which is still there today, right on the Pan American Highway in the Mixteca Alta. The primary languages spoken in that community at that time were Mixtec and Chocho, or Niusawi and Ngiwa, and so that they were using Nahuatl as a lingua franca, or a vehicular language, to communicate with one another, probably as a compromise language, but also to communicate with Spanish officials, since Spanish officials would be checking this book periodically. So that it's a very early text. I mean, really, we don't have that many Nahuatl texts from the 1540s and 1550s. And so to get a 62-page text written entirely in Nahuatl, with some Mixtec words sprinkled in here and there, referring to the Mixtec calendar, is pretty cool. It really, as you say, using the Latin alphabet, Arabic numbers, Roman numerals, Mesoamerican pictographic writing conventions, that would likely be intelligible across linguistic boundaries. This text, I think, it shows, demonstrates a real creative adaptation. These people have picked up writing, alphabetic writing, in another language and are using it functionally to keep track of the expenses and the income of this community over a 15-year period, because that's what this document is. It's a libro de cuentas based on a Spanish model in which the new municipal council that has been recognized by the Spanish authorities, all of the noble men in the community are on a town council, and they have created a caja de la comunidad, a treasury chest, where income that is earned from this new money economy is kept, and they are keeping a ledger to document the income and expenditures of the community in this time. So, you know, this community is adapting and adopting new writing systems, the new money economy, a new form of government. It's just remarkable that this is all happening, you know, beginning in 1550, only a generation after the conquest, really. And this is a time before Mixtec and Chocho writing had been developed. And that would happen later. But Mixtec and Chocho Otomanguean languages were tonal languages and presented difficulties for creating an orthography, whereas Nahuatl doesn't have tone. It has, you know, glottal stop and long vowels that weren't always recorded, but nothing as formidable as tone, like the Otomanguean languages. So that Nahuatl was, as I said, a lingua franca. And this manuscript is sort of like a Rosetta Stone in that I could not have understood many of the pictorial conventions, you know, the little hands and heads, for example, you know, without recourse to the alphabetic text. In fact, I'm going to talk about some of these things on Friday at the Nahuatl conference.
Yeah, you know, I love that this text is really showing, you know, the adaptability of this people. That they're really, you know, I hate that this is the reality, but there are a lot of stereotypes that are presented in media and in contemporary Western culture of Indigenous people as uneducated. But here we have a group of people who were already educated. They already had their own writing systems. They had ways of communicating. And so when they were introduced to new writing systems under this kind of, you know, somewhat oppressive, as you can discuss, kind of somewhat oppressive colonial forces, they are still willing to be very adaptable and take on these new forms of communication, and they're eager to learn new systems, which I find really remarkable. So not even just the writing systems, but also these new economic systems and these new systems of you know, the silkworm cultivation, which is, as you describe it, extremely tedious and very complicated. But I also wanted to pick up on one thing. You know, you mentioned how there's this insertion of Mixtec words related to the calendar system, and so I wanted to come back to this symbol, which is often called an AO symbol, which is a year glyph. So it's presented as a year glyph in the imagery, in the iconography, and then we see that it's being called a year in Mixtec. But one of the things that I find really remarkable about this text is that it includes silkworm iconography, which is of course completely new to the glyphic pictorial writing system that this is drawing from. And so, and I actually went through and I looked at all of my texts, and it looks like in the Mixtec text we have that AO symbol. In the more like Aztec, Central Mexican texts, we rarely see that AO symbol, but we do see it in the Codex Borgia, and in the Codex Borgia, it has the green leaves on it, where it doesn't in the Mixtec writing. So I think that's really interesting that they're including this shiwit. So shiwit meaning year, but also meaning like green or herb or leaf or things like that. So that this is including like all these different languages also in the iconography that we have, like what's usually seen as a Mixtec symbol, but with a Nahuatl kind of designation of the shiwit, but in this case, a European mulberry leaf that is then feeding the silkworm, which also then makes an appearance on that AO symbol. So it was really, really remarkable. And I was hoping you could speak a little bit to to that kind of discovery, because I think those kinds of discoveries are what gets me very excited about this field, is going through and trying to recover this kind of information.
Yeah, well, that's great. You know, I wasn't aware of the shiwit in the Codex Borgia. I had looked at all of the Mixtec codices looking for that, and well, I'm jumping ahead, but that's a fascinating find. Let me share my screen and show you what we mean here
Okay.
by some of this. So I am going to go to full screen here, and there we go, and advance. So to summarize, this is a 62-page libro de cuentas from a community called Santa Catalina Texupan in the Mixteca Alta. It's written over a 15-year period, and it really has three components: alphabetic, pictographic, and numerical text. This was a Spanish introduction, and so the unique thing about this Libro de Cuentas is that the Spanish versions did not have any pictorial components, whereas in the case of the Codex Sierra, which is from this community Texupan, which is right up here along the Pan American Highway in the Mixteca Alta, in the heartland of the Mixteca in northwestern Oaxaca. And so we have, this is the format of the Sierra with the year, the AO year glyph at the top. Oops. And then an entry with a payment of, in this case, 130 pesos for the salaries of the town hall officials, the cabildo officials. And there we have a depiction of the caja de comunidad, the monies being paid out from the caja for the salaries, the annual salaries of those officials. And look at the beautiful calligraphy here. It looks like the artist is copying, you know, from a book, a printed book, the initial elaborate letter. Here in the second entry, we have 15 pesos spent for inks and paper and a book. And so here they are purchasing items that are Castilian. It says mochi Castilian, right? So that these are imported inks and paper imported from Europe. In fact, the paper of this document is either from Spain or Italy. It has watermarks that show its European origins. And so instead of using amate, local fig bark paper, they are importing this paper. It's a very fine, coarse paper that has survived, you know, hundreds of years. And they are using natural dyes for the most part, including cochineal for the bright red. And in the next century, they are, you know, purchasing blankets for the hospital. They have a hospital to tend to the sick that is right next to the church. And in the final entry here, they are spending 30 pesos for cacao, for chocolate, for the palace, the Teopan, where the nobles live, so that the Teopan is really this complex of houses where the nobility of the community lived before and after the conquest. And in fact, the cabildo met in the Teopan, so that we have transformations alongside continuities, and so this is just one of the 62 pages, and we can see, you know, the format here Um, and that year sign that Felicia was talking about is very clear here in the pre-conquest Codex Vienna, um, eh, up above here, referring to the year of 9 rabbit and the classic AO sign. You can see that. You can see that well, the AO there, yeah.
Yes. Mhm.
And this is commemorating the marriage of two of a founding dynasty in Apawala or Utah. And so the calendar is so important in so many of these codices, whether Aztec or Mixtec, and the so that at the beginning of each year there is this glyph. But what is really interesting about this codex is that there's a leaf wrapped around the AO sign. And so we have a reference here to the year 6 reed. And so, we have a typical introduction here in Nahuatl to the Shiwit 1551, and then it's spelled out using the vigesimal numbering system based on 20. But then we come to this word, quilla, nuwio. That quilla means year in Mixtec, and nuwio refers to 6 reed in the special calendrical lexicon. They use different words for numbers and symbols in this calendrical lexicon. It's probably an archaic honorific register. These references are to the solar calendar, the count of 365 days, that the Mixtecs called quilla and the Nahuatls called shiwit. And each used the same 4 year bearer signs, reed, flint, house, and rabbit, with the numbers 1 through 13. And so it took 52 years, 4 times 13, to complete a full cycle of rotating year bearers and numbers. And what's interesting is that the Aztec and Mixtec solar calendars were not entirely concordant in this period. The Mixtec year bearer is consistently 1 digit less than the Aztec, because the Aztec calendar started 40 days earlier, so that the Aztec year 2 reed would correspond roughly with the Mixtec year 1 reed. And this is significant because the Codex Sierra records a Mixtec correlation with the Christian calendar, not an Aztec. And so we have, a typical reference to the year, quilla nuio, here. And we see this throughout the manuscript, so that they are constantly referring to the year in Mixtec corresponding to the Christian year. So it's likely that the text was produced by Mixtec writers, not Nahuatl writers, or not Aztec writers, who were fluent in the Nahuatl language, since Nahuatls had no reason to record years in the Mixtec language, so that Mixtecs were writing in Nahuatl before alphabetic writing had been fully developed in their native language. Going back to this leaf, I had not seen this before. I was thinking, okay, so the leaf, or it makes sense in Nahuatl, shiwit, for year, because it's the same word for leaf. But I had not seen it wrapped around the AO sign like that. And I was wondering, where's this come from? At first it looked like ornamentation. And I was thinking, is there a model that they're using for this? I mean, certainly there's no European model. I mean, in medieval and Renaissance art, you do have leaves, fig leaves, especially to cover nude classical and biblical figures, but not in reference to years. Eventually, as the manuscript goes on, it occurred to me that it not only works for Nahuatl, shiwit is year or leaf, but in Mixtec, Kuya is year and kui is leaf. The words are probably related, and only one vowel separates the two in meaning, so that the glyph worked well in Nahuatl and Mixtec. After a while, I began to realize that, wow, the leaf is getting bigger and bigger. And this is a good example on page 47 in 1561. The year sign is actually embedded in a larger leaf. And on that page, that's the first page that revenue is recorded, because this is a book of accounts that's supposed to record both income and expenditures, but it records mainly expenditures until the last 4 years of the manuscript, and that's when they begin to register revenue. And silk is it's the source of most of the income. 75% of the income came from silk production. On this page, for example, there's 690 pounds of silk shown, wrapped neatly and twisted in hanks. And that amounts to over 3,000 pesos of income, which is a large sum in this period of the 1560s. And so they are using, in this case, there's so much going on, right? So there is the place glyph of Mexico City. So there is someone who has come from Mexico City to purchase the silk, a Spaniard, and the quantity of silk is depicted by the feather here representing 400, so 400 pounds there. And each of these little flags or pontli represents 20 in the traditional counting system. And this is, a half of 20. So we get 690. And this is the money that's generated from that sale. Woodrow Borah wrote a fabulous book in 1943 about silk production in New Spain. And Gonzalo de las Casas, an encomendero, wrote a guide on how to grow silk in 1581 that I consulted at the John Carter Brown Library in Providence. And so I learned so much from those two sources about this industry. And it turns out that the Spaniards introduced silkworms, really early in the 1530s, including Cortez and some of the conquistadores, thinking that this would be an ideal place for sericulture, for silk production, which is a very technical enterprise. And in fact, it failed just about everywhere except the Mixteca, which had a suitable climate and altitude for growing worms and for planting mulberry trees, because silkworms feed on the leaves of mulberry trees. So that these communities in the Mixteca were producing silk as corporate enterprises, everyone in the community being involved in the production, very few people actually getting paid for the labor, but producing silk during a period when there was a sort of agricultural lull, when there was not much work in the fields. And so the industry took off, and many of these communities prospered greatly in the middle of the 16th century by producing this completely new, thing that kind of made sense to them, in the sense that they had very good textile traditions, and so they started producing silk and silk cloths. And so we have, other examples here of that, of the prominence of the leaf. And it occurred to me that the heart-shaped leaf that we see here looks a lot like the leaf of a mulberry tree. Because, as I said, sericulture depends on mulberry leaves. Silkworms feed on the leaves before spinning cocoons. And the industry in New Spain first relied on native trees, which grew wild, and then imported European black mulberry trees to ensure a steady supply of the leaves that are essential to the growth of silkworms. And the leaves were also used to transfer worms from one tray to another, leaving their waste behind after molting. And native trees in Mexico produce long, bright green, heart-shaped leaves. And so, to me, many of these, leaves look like mulberry leaves. Here we have some images of people being instructed to feed these leaves to the worms that are in these petates, right? That are on these like reed mats, and these people would get paid 20 pesos for this work. We have another example here. You can even see the little gusanos. They also built worm houses, Ichan Seda or Oquilcali worm house, or silk home, or literally silk's home, using the word chantli, Ichan Seda there. And they purchased cloths that served a vital function. The female moths were placed on the cloths and the males were brought to fertilize them. The female laid their eggs in single layers on the cloth, covering them with a protective sticky layer, and then all the moths died. And the Roman numeral here, 15, on the cloth refers to the number of blankets that they purchased. And this is great. I mean, like most mantas, the blankets consist of 3 vertical panels or strips, each the width of a backstrap loom, with which they were woven, the traditional method of weaving that women continue to practice in many parts of Mesoamerica. So they spent 20 pesos for these cloths, and they sometimes had to hire Spaniards to oversee this activity, who were silk masters. And so this gentleman was paid 42 pesos, 20 plus 2 pieces of 8 for his seasonal work. And so, in this period, they were earning close to 2,000 pesos a year, and most of their income was coming from this silk. The artist who drew the last large leaf on the penultimate page of the manuscript embellished the composition in 3 remarkable ways. First, you can see he drew a 3-dimensional image of what appears to be a twisted leaf, compared to many flat representations of leaves depicted early in the manuscript, so that the native artist is incorporating the 3-dimensional illusionistic Renaissance style of European art, so that as opposed to the flat 1-dimensional profile depiction of the Spaniard here. The artist then attached what might be a cocoon to the leaf on the far left, a reference maybe to all the source of the silk depicted on the same page. And finally, and most surprisingly, the artist drew the year sign as a silkworm, its head emerging from the bottom corner of the A sign of the glyph. The worm's head is located on the lower left side here, with small antennae on either side of the labrum. Only one is visible, as the worm is depicted in profile, which serves as an upper lip. The dorsal horn at the opposite end of the worm here is painted red, and the artist seems to have drawn a slim silk thread issuing forth from the mouth. In fact, the worm produces silk from its spinnerets, which are located by the mouth. So that this is truly remarkable that the artist decided to incorporate the silkworm into the year glyph, and given the importance of silk to the community and the manuscript's frequent references to sericulture, it's fitting that the artist chose to depict the mulberry leaf, a symbol of the silk industry. But the depiction of the leaf and its juxtaposition with the year sign might be both symbolic and intentional. In Mexico, the deciduous mulberry tree begins to bud in late January and early February, and leaves appear in March. Perhaps the artist used the new leaves to mark the annual passage of time, adjusted to the Christian calendar year that began in late March, not January 1st, when the leaves were in full bloom. Because from the 11th to the 16th centuries, the Feast of the Annunciation on March 25th was the first official day of the Christian year in most parts of Europe, including Spain. When Pope Gregory XIII introduced a new Gregorian calendar in 1582, Spain and many other states in Europe adopted the first day of January as the first day of the year. But the Codex Sierra predates the introduction of the Gregorian calendar. And so this manuscript is organized according to the Christian calendar. And the year would have started when the mulberry leaves were coming in on the trees. So that, so it's fascinating that the artist then is employing a convention that works in both languages, literally attaching leaves to year glyphs in the manuscript. Before Felicia mentioned the Borgia, I really want to see these images now. The only other manuscript I knew that used the leaf for the year glyph was the Lienzo of Tequistepec II, where large leaves are attached to the year glyphs. This is in the same silk producing region, and it's a lienzo, a cloth manuscript that is done around the same time as the Codex Sierra. So I consider this coincidence as evidence of the diffusion of pictographic writing techniques among artists in the region, a process that continued to evolve in the 16th century despite the introduction of alphabetic writing. And in this case, alongside alphabetic text. I'm going to stop sharing right now. There we go.
I think that it's really, for me, quite fascinating the ways that we can see how much this writing system and these people, this culture, is just able to absorb and digest and really incorporate new elements from Europe. And so, I think one of the nice things about your book is that it kind of reveals these stories, right? So even though this is really just a log, it's a book of accounts. There are so many stories that are rich and that are embedded in this text. We can see the resourcefulness of the people. We can see the perseverance. We see a lot of mention of the cacica, Doña Catalina. We also see a lot of struggle and tragedy that is kind of seen in that these monetary fluctuations in the community, and then also the years that go by sometimes where there is no writing, and so these stories that are kind of hidden and untold, but are influencing this text. And so I was hoping again that you could share a little bit about some of these stories, whether it's about Doña Carolina, this rarely seen woman leader who is being written about here, or about the tragedy, because this is a tragic time that we're getting this document from, right? There's a lot of tragedy, colonial forces, a lot of illness, a lot of suffering in the community as well.
Yeah, that's a great question. I'm going to hold off on Doña Catalina because that's
Okay.
something, but that's, I think, one advantage of having worked so long on this manuscript. I like to joke that I ended up working on this more than the Tlaquiloque, the artists and the writers, took to actually produce it. 15 years, right? is that I also found a lot of other documentation in the, especially in the National Archive in Mexico City, on this community during this period, which shed light on what was happening. So, I understood that I don't want to study a text in isolation. I want to understand what else is happening, not only in that community, but in the region and also in New Spain in general. And I'm struck by how the Codex gives the impression of an orderly, prosperous indigenous community that used its newfound wealth to purchase a wide variety of items for their new church and for new novel enterprises, especially using revenue from silk production, which as we'll see, there was a boom and then there was a bust, unfortunately, and so these were the boom years. The leaders and citizens of Texupan embraced introductions if they seemed to have utility. They weren't opposed to new things. Um, if these things could support the community's own interests. The manuscript, I think, documents the community's creative genius in adopting new technologies and their apparent generosity in welcoming outsiders, whom they often housed and fed. The Tekpan, or palace, continued to play a central role in organizing the community's most vital activities. Local elites received the recognition that they deserved as members of the new Spanish-style municipal council. Um, Residents celebrated numerous feast days each year, capped off by the celebration of their patron saint, Santa Catalina, for whom their cacica was named, Doña Catalina, and the local Teopanenque, those who lived at the church, were serving in the church and learned to play new musical instruments, representing the community's collective embrace of Christianity. Both indigenous and Spanish healers tended to sick people. You had Spanish boticarios who were being hired, and you had a hospital that was presumably trying its best to deal with the sick and in this time of many plagues and epidemics. um, and and the community was also continuing to grow maize, and they also grew wheat. They were producing cheese and wool because they were running sheep and goats, and leaders were paying royal tribute as subjects of the crown. Um, and yet, you know, despite these signs of prosperity and order, I my research into the archival record revealed all these tensions and conflicts that troubled the community in this period, that really threatened its livelihood and existence. Um, there were many questions uh, that I had that remained unanswered. The number one question was, did community officials who guarded the keys to the Caja de Comunidad and their colleagues on the town council decide what to buy with the surplus? To what degree were their decisions dictated or influenced by Spanish officials and priests? Um, and because I found many petitions and other legal documents from the period in which the Book of Accounts was produced. And many of these petitions complained about the exorbitant demands that Spanish officials, both secular and ecclesiastical, were making on the community's resources. For example, a conspicuous annual expense is the vicar's food, the head priest's food and drink. The annual cost of feeding the vicar always exceeded the yearly cost of food for Texupan's entire nobility, which numbered dozens of people. He was getting twice as much money for his food and drink as the nobility And in general, church expenses consumed a huge part of the community's surplus, more than 60%. Um, and when the Dominicans arrived in the community in 1563, the governor and nobles of the community wrote a petition to the viceroy in Mexico City, saying that they were fearful that the friars wanted to use all their money from their caja for everything that they needed to support themselves, and to build a new church, and to build a monastery. They wanted to build a monastery on some of the community's best arable lands and orchards. They wanted their own orchard next to the convento, and this would cause great harm and damage. And they wrote another document to the viceroy, petitioning to be exempted from building a house for the friars. They clearly did not want the friars living in their community. And they complained also about the Spanish alcaldes mayores or corregidores. These were the Spanish officials, who were in charge of collecting tribute and adjudicating in these communities. They would come around, periodically to check the libro de cuentas, and to collect tribute. And in 1563, the community leaders complained that he comes too often. And when he comes, we always have to pay him, and he's getting paid much more than and he's coming much more than he should, according to the ordinances governing such visits. They also complained that he compelled indigenous authorities to allow Spaniards to live in the community and to raise silk, which was prohibited. They argued that the community alone should be able to cultivate silk without interference from or competition with Spaniards. They complained about outsiders pasturing their sheep and goats within the community's borders beyond the designated areas where they're allowed to pasture, and therefore damaging their crops. They complained about congregación, about the fact that various communities outside of Texupan were being forced to move to the center and abandon their ancestral lands, and this was very much resisted by these communities who did not want to move. And so many of these conflicts that we see are typical throughout New Spain that affect indigenous pueblos, everywhere, not just Texupan. And there's one major change that happens in 1564 that I think ends up that I think that's why that's why the Libro de Cuentas ends in that year. And I don't know if you want to talk about that change right now, but it's a real big one.
Yeah, I think definitely it's worth. I know we're running low on time, and so I definitely want to talk about this. And I think it's especially important when we're talking about not just Mesoamerica, but colonization in general, indigenous populations in general, and what happens under under colonization to a lot of these indigenous communities. And it's continuing to happen, right? It looks a little bit different, but this is something that is continuing to happen. And that is, you're really speaking in this text to this problem of Western capitalism and colonization, and uh, their their habit, their policy of going into indigenous communities, introducing these new systems like monetary systems, extracting resources, be it natural resources or human resources, labor forces, and then introducing poverty. And this is, I think, something that a lot of people don't necessarily think about. That if you have a system, if you have an existing system, an indigenous system that isn't run on money, on these kind of like these arbitrary tokens that have fake value, You don't have poverty. You have other systems. You have trade systems. You have debt systems, different ways of exchange, and these communities are able to support themselves. But when you extract those natural resources and you extract their labor, and then you introduce money, then you end up with rampant poverty, which is something that that we're definitely seeing here. And I think for me, it's really important to talk about because there are these myths about the Aztec Empire, that they're extremely patriarchal and they're extreme kind of oppressive forces. But what we're seeing here is that this is kind of an unprecedented level of patriarchy and and oppression that's taking place under the Spanish rule. And so I love that you're really exposing what's going on here, and you have a really wonderful excerpt that you've taken out of a letter, and that I hope you'll share with us now. Just hearing from those indigenous voices about how bad it actually is, even for the nobility, even for the people who are doing well. We're not even getting the voices of the commoners, but the nobility are saying, no, this is just bad. Right?
Yeah, yeah. The Codex corresponds exactly with the reign of Viceroy Don Luis de Velasco from 1550 to 1564. And Velasco, deserves credit in that he advocated in many ways. I think that Atelia Ruiz Medrano has shown that he advocated in many ways for indigenous pueblos, but when he dies in 1564, there's a 2-year absence. There is no viceroy, and the Audiencia rules New Spain. And during this period, they decide to increase royal tribute assessments. So Texhupan's tribute, which at the beginning in 1550 was 180 pesos a year, is raised in 1564 to 1,567 pesos a year. That's an 870% increase over a 15-year period. And it's actually, according to the Libro de Tasaciones de Nueva España, it's silk master Gonzalo de las Casas, the guy who wrote the manual published in 1581, published in Granada, Spain, about how to grow silk. He was the encomendero of nearby community Yanhuitlan. He masterminded the proposed increase. He convinced the Audiencia in Mexico City that Texupan and all these other silk producing communities could generate greater profits for royal coffers if they produced more silk. And so Texupan was not the only town targeted for higher taxes. Las Casas made the same recommendation for every other town in the Mixteca. And so, this must have presented Texupan and neighboring communities with new and unwelcome challenges, because the revised tribute assessment, probably contributed in some way to the end of this book of accounts. The Codex records no expenditures for 1564. And maybe the pages for expenditures were lost, but in reality, there would have been few expenditures to record anyway, considering how small the surplus would have been if they had to pay that much in tribute. The recommendations made by Las Casas gambled on the ability of communities to maximize silk production, an industry that was subject to variable yields, and to remit most, if not all, of their profits to the crown. So that after the death of Viceroy Velasco, you have these royal agents in the Viceroy capital who seize the opportunity to raise revenue at the expense of native communities, which were continuing to decline in wealth and population during this period. Many communities in central Mexico were impacted by the new tribute assessments of the 1560s. There is this famous Nahuatl letter from the Cabildo of Huexotzinco in central Mexico to the king, expressing the frustration and desperation of indigenous subjects who failed to comprehend the logic of being taxed to the point of poverty. And I'm going to share an excerpt translated by James Lockhart from the letter of Huexotzinco to the crown. It says, in response to the new tribute, but now we are taken aback and very afraid, and we ask, have we done something wrong? Have we somehow behaved badly and ill toward you, our sovereign Lord? Or have we committed some sin against Almighty God? Perhaps you have heard something of our wickedness, and for that reason now this very great tribute has fallen upon us, 7 times exceeding all we had paid before, the 2,000 pesos. And we declare it to you that it will not be too long before your city of Huexotzinco completely disappears and perishes, because our fathers, grandfathers, and ancestors knew no tribute and gave tribute to no one, but were independent. And we nobles who guard your subjects are now truly very poor. Nobility is seen among us no longer. Now we resemble the commoners. Now this is a real heavy statement there, because their tribute had been raised to 14,800 pesos, in addition to an unspecified amount of maize that they were supposed to pay. And so, whereas Spaniards were required to pay a quinto in taxes to the crown for, mining enterprises, for military expeditions, whatever wealth they gained, they were required to pay a quinto. Indigenous communities like Huexotzinco and like Texupan and like Tlatelolco, and I went through the Libro de las Tasaciones and realized that indigenous communities were expected to pay 4 quintos of their total profits to the crown in 1565. They were expected to pay 80% of their surplus and profits. And so it struck me that, that, okay, the Spaniards wanted to create this money economy. And in places where there was no silver, they had to create enterprises that would generate money that could then pay tribute. And so they weren't interested in traditional tribute items like feathers and other types of goods like that. And so they were intent on creating economic enterprises. But then when these enterprises became profitable, they would move in and try to take it over, basically, or take all the wealth from it. And so ultimately what happened with silk production, according to Woodrow Borah, is that the greed of native officials, rather the greed of Spanish officials, and the opening of the China trade in the 1580s, when Spain began to import large quantities of silk directly from China through Manila, ended up the silk industry in Mexico could not compete. But when we look at a document from Texupan that is a little later, in 1579, the Relaciones Geográficas, the report that Texupan made to the king about their community, it's clear that population loss is the most profound change. The period covered by the Codex Sierra falls between 2 catastrophic epidemics in 1545 and 1576. And each of these outbreaks, one was certainly smallpox, the other is thought to be something else, but each of these outbreaks wiped out about half of the community's population. The Relación or report was written about 3 years after the epidemic of 1576. The report estimates the population of Texupan when Cortez arrived to have been about 12,000 people, and concludes that it had dwindled to no more than 750 by 1579. These numbers actually refer to heads of families, and Bora and Cook have used them to estimate the population of Texupan in the 1520s at around 54,000 when the Spaniards arrived, declining to 3,000 by 1569 and 1,600 by 1590. So that the report from Texupan in 1579 states that the community had lots of mulberry trees, but there was little silk because the population had been ravaged by disease. And so the report attributes the decline of silk production to population loss. And in response to the paradoxical question number 15 of the 50 questions in the Relación Geográfica, drafted exclusively for the Americas, it inquired whether people lived better in 1579 than they had in ancient times. What a question. Are you living better or worse now than you lived in the past, in ancient times? And the respondents replied that they used to live better, more healthier lives in the past. So it's so difficult, if not impossible, to fathom the changes that occurred in this community in the decades between the arrival of the Spaniards in the 1520s and this Relación, this report of 1579, in which they produced a fabulous map of the community that there it is. This iconic map of the community, in which now you can see the new church and the convent next to it, the monastery, and the orchard that belonged to the Dominicans, and that the community has been congregated now into this traza, this layout, this urban grid. But you can still see very prominently the Teopan, the palace, in the middle of this map. So that, these authors and artists from Texupan, they created their book of accounts in the middle of this 60-year period between the conquest and the Relación of 1579. And so this codex sort of offers glimpses into the history of their community that other sources cannot provide. The archival record makes occasional references to Texupan here and there, but this manuscript preserves data on the pueblo over a 15-year period, and it really shows a complex process of adaptation and innovation, change and conflict that characterized the collision and convergence of indigenous peoples and Europeans in the 16th century. I think that, in many ways it shows that the conquest was, a long process rather than an isolated event, and that this process is continuing in many ways in the 16th century as a community as small as Texupan. Well, it wasn't small to begin with, but it certainly was small by the end of the 16th century. Is being pulled into the transatlantic and trans-Pacific, economies, in the sense that some of the silk that they're producing is being exported to Europe for profit by Spanish merchants. But ultimately, their industry is undermined by the importation of silk from China by the end of the century. So it's a fascinating dynamic there between the local and the global economies.
Yeah, it's this wonderful, if not horrifying, view of the globalization that was to come and that we're experiencing right now. Definitely. I know we're out of time, and so I did want to bring up that we have some questions, Kevin, in the Q&A. I don't know if you would like me to read them for you, or if you can see them.
I can see them, yeah.
So we have one from Alejandro
Yes,
Renteria.
Alejandro Piali,
Yeah.
Alejandro. Yes, I have a chapter I have two chapters in this book, one called Teopan Church. That was the term that they used, for the, uh, the place of the deity, and Tekpan Palace. And in each, I tried to show the continuities and changes that affected the religious life of this community, as well as the governance, and the active participation of many nobles in the church, um, as teopanenke, as people who literally live in the church. From the verb nemi. That's kind of an interesting term for these people that I haven't seen elsewhere. Um, it's a term that suggests that the local officials are very much involved in church activities, and it's true that they are spending a lot of money on their church, for various things, and for buildings and ornamentation and musical instruments, and those Teopanenke are also being paid a salary, like the Cabildo officials. And so, there is a lot of crossover there, um, involving the elites, of the community in terms of their participation in the church and the palace. What one really interesting thing is that the TechPon is still redistributing a lot of this money that is coming in from silk production. And you can see this in the manuscript. There are numerous religious feasts, about 20 a year, that are organized. And it's the TechPon who is sponsoring those feasts, the palace. And this is one thing that we observe about communities, native communities today, is that there is a great deal of communal feasting, which is sort of a social support network, so that people have access to food, on a periodic basis, and that the TechPon was also paying local people for a lot of goods and services that were being provided, so that they were, in a sense, distributing these funds within the community. So great question, Alejandro. So how did indigenous communities exchange their goods for pesos? That's an interesting question. I think the only this Libro de Cuentas doesn't account for all of the commercial activity in the community. There's still a lot going on that I don't think is represented by this Libro de Cuentas. There is the purchase of maize, and cacao for the TechPon, for example, and those are good examples of how um, pesos are being exchanged for quantities of maize and cacao that are provided by local merchants. So it's very interesting. There are also lots of traditional goods being bought, like quetzal feathers. Like at one point, the community, buys all these quetzal feathers so that they can decorate the Altepet properties, whatever that means, which is really interesting. The Tecpan decides that it needs a teponasli, a log drum. And so they buy that off of a local vendor, so it's a good question, Patricia. And so there is clearly bartering probably going on still, but you can see this community being integrated more and more into the money economy. And I think Jimena had a question. Is there any reference in the Codex to the ocean, ports, or ships? That's a great one. I know why you asked that question, Jimena. I don't think so. That's a good one. I don't think so. They are pretty high up in the highlands there. And so I don't remember a single reference to the ocean. Sergio had a question. Yes. So the question has to do with the letter from Huexotzinco, as if he were totally alien to the concept of capitalist exploitation, as if he could not have understood that his pledge meant nothing in the mind of the Spaniards. He was appealing to reason. Well, right? No, it's true. There's no evidence that the king ever read this letter, unfortunately, that was written, which is such a beautiful, elegant letter that is now in the Archive of the Indies in Seville. It did not have a Spanish translation. It was written in the most beautiful Nahuatl, in the most reverential Huehuetlatoli, the most elegant language befitting of a king. And so it's pretty clear that this letter, unfortunately, had no impact on the king because he never read it, because he couldn't have read Nahuatl. But nonetheless, it was an attempt on the part of this community to cut out the middleman and go straight to, the king, probably having failed to have any impact on the middlemen, that is the viceregal officials, in their pleas. And in the book, in the conclusion, I note, other examples, including examples from Tlatelolco and Tenochtitlan, in which people were placed in a very difficult position in the 1560s and were pleading with viceregal officials that these increases were exorbitant and that they couldn't handle them. In fact, it's unfortunately likely that the last dynastic ruler of Tenochtitlan, who was the governor in the 1560s, who was imprisoned at one point for not being able to produce the tribute that was being assessed. It's in my opinion likely that he committed suicide in response to the demands at the time. And after his death, a governor of Tenochtitlan was brought in from another community, and it represented a real shocking change. But I'm not the only one to have commented on this. Charles Gibson, in his famous book on the Aztecs under Spanish rule, published in 1964, wrote about the transformations of the 1560s. And Atelia Ruiz Medrano, Mexican historian, has also written about these challenges. And so, some historians have taken a different tact and have argued that the tribute increases were really not that substantial and that they could deal with them. And so, to some extent, I think that this deserves further study. and it seems to me that it did represent a real burden, especially in this period when all communities, including Tlaxcala, the the community that is known for having received the exemptions of tribute and favors in this period, they were declining as well, as Charles Gibson demonstrated in his first book published in 1952 on Tlaxcala. So, this is colonial history, and colonialism benefits the colonizers in this period. And this was a time when the Spanish crown was trying to get the Indies more and more to pay for its own activities, to pay for its administration. This is a time when the Spanish crown was going bankrupt periodically, when it could no longer pay its debts. This happened, 5 or 6 times in the 1560s, 70s, 80s, and 90s, when Philip II could not pay off his creditors, and so this is heavy history in a way. I think that's it for the questions.
We do have one more question from
Good.
Sophia involving the export of silk. She says, do you know if they still survive and where they travel to specifically? Is there a distinguishable difference between the silk exported from Texupan and China? I ask because the textile tradition of the Americas. It is also interesting to think about how silk is still interwoven into contemporaneous textiles in the Oaxaca region as well.
No, absolutely. That's a great question, Sophia. In fact, there are some independent silk producers in Oaxaca, in the Mixteca, people growing silk on their own, producing small quantities. And the archival record indicates that a lot of people were involved in this for themselves, in addition to the corporate production of these communities. That people independently owned, silk grain and were cultivating silk on their own. And yeah, as I said, this continues in some parts of Oaxaca. Woodrow Borah argued that the silk produced in Mexico was actually, of a different quality than that produced in China, and was still highly valued in comparison to the Chinese product. And so that it's the introduction of Chinese silk cannot alone explain why the industry, went to bust. It was, mismanagement of Spanish officials, population loss, the greed of trying to, take too much of the surplus, and several other factors. So it's a great question, Sophia. Thank you so much.
And thank you, Kevin. I've really enjoyed talking to you about your book, and I'm sure, we'll talk more about it in the future. This is really, again, I want to emphasize what a pleasure it is to have read this text. It's a beautiful book. And I strongly encourage people to pick it up, because, we've only kind of scratched the surface of a lot of the things that you're uncovering here. So thank you again for your time, and thank you all attendees for joining us in our conversation today. And I wish you all a prosperous time. I know that we're not living through as much of a of a horrible time as we see in this text, but these are difficult times, and so I want to wish everyone a safe time out there, and a wonderful rest of the week, and enjoy your summers.
Thank you so much, Felicia. And thank you, Ari and Brian.